The extent of the problem of institutional child abuse in Australia is really unknown. What I can do is give you an estimate for Victoria, and this is looking at child sexual assault and the Catholic Church only. Victorian Law Reform Commission says they tell us that about 10% of children will ever report their crimes to the police, child sex crimes to the police, and Victoria Police say that only about 8% will report. So if we use those figures and we look at the number of people who have reported to both the church in Victoria and to the police, we're looking at somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 roughly. So obviously we need to do more research here to get a national perspective, but if those numbers are mirrored or represented across the country, we obviously have a very high number of victims. The Catholic Church has certainly received a lot of publicity around the area of child sexual assault. But if we work out if the Catholic Church is the worst offender or not, what we can refer to is a figure from Professor Patrick Parkinson from the Faculty of Law at Sydney University, and he is arguing that Catholic clergy offending is 6 times greater than all other religious organisations put together in Australia. So that number too was certainly reflected in the number of witnesses at the Victorian inquiry, the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry into sexual assault. And it will be interesting to see what happens now with the Royal Commission coming up, to see if that same number is reflected in the Royal Commission. There are multiple legal barriers for victims when they are trying to find some justice. The very first one we need to think about is the statute of limitations. One of the problems with child sexual assault is that it inherently takes decades, if ever, for a person, for a survivor or victim to actually disclose the crime or to report the crime. So the statute of limitations certainly does not reflect that inherent element of child sexual assault, and it is one area of the law that certainly does need reforming. The Catholic Church per se is not a legal entity, but it does have a property trust, and that property trust is the only legal entity that one can sue. The Ellis defence emerged from a 2007 New South Wales Court of Appeal case, which basically where the church argued that a victim of sexual assault cannot sue the property trust because the trustees were never responsible for the behaviour of the priest. So basically at the moment, the church is immune from suit, particularly for historical sex offences. The third barrier for victims relates to what is called the doctrine of corporation sole. Bishops and archbishops in Australia are not corporations sole, which means that they cannot be held liable for any of the wrongdoings of their predecessors. The fourth area relates to vicarious liability. The law in relation to vicarious liability in Australia is not really settled, but at the moment, basically, one cannot try and sue an employer vis-à-vis the Catholic Church for the sexual crimes, sex crimes of one of its employees, such as a priest or a Christian brother. Now, all of these barriers for victims has meant really that they have had not much choice other than to go back to the Catholic Church to try and find some justice. And broadly speaking, they have not only not found justice back at the Catholic Church, in fact, they have found that they have been exposed to secondary abuse and secondary trauma. For the Royal Commission to deliver justice for victims and survivors, there are several things or elements that they will need to address. The first one is that of the truth. All of the interviewees in my research basically said they need the truth to be out there. And that's their own truth, but also they need the church and the perpetrators to also talk about the truth. The second element that needs addressing is that of accountability. Accountability would look like prosecuting both the offender and the person who has covered up or concealed the crime. Now, the Royal Commission is not a prosecutorial body, but it will be liaising with the officers of public prosecutions and the police in each state and territory. In relation to mandatory reporting, we do require, I think, some legislation requiring clergy to report not only to Department of Human Services, but also to the police.